Hi, I'm Robert Chisholm from Chisholm Chisholm Kilpatrick. I'm a partner here. Joining me is Zach Stolz, also a partner at CCK. And today we're going to talk about some of the biggest changes over the last 30 years in veterans law. So, a couple of things to think about here over the last 30 years. The first is that the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims was created in 1988. And before the creation of the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, veterans did not have a right to judicial review. Now, what does that mean, practically speaking? What it means is that veterans would file a claim at the regional office, and if it was denied at the regional office, they could appeal to the Board of Veterans Appeals. But that was really the last stop for any case. There was no right to independent judicial review. So, with the creation of the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, it opened the door to widespread judicial precedent. And judicial precedent really means decision making by the court that interpreted statutes, regulations, and policies of the VA for the first time. And it also allowed, for the first time, veterans to hire legal counsel to represent them in a court. And it allowed the growth of a veterans bar for representatives of veterans before this court. The next big thing that happened in the last 30 years is the expansion of presumptive service connection. And what presumptive service connection means is that if you served in a certain location at a certain time and you developed an illness, the VA is going to presume that illness is related to your service. So let's go through a couple examples of this. First of all, there was the Gulf War illnesses from 1994 to the present, and the presumptions for veterans serving in Southwest Asia. For veterans that served in Vietnam, Agent Orange is one of the largest presumptions. So conditions like diabetes, Parkinson's, hypertension were all added through legislation and court cases. In addition, there was a class action lawsuit filed a long time ago in federal court called Niemer. That had a huge impact on the field of veterans law and still does to this day. And then the most recent iteration of presumptive service connections was the PACT Act from 2022, which created a major expansion of presumptive service connection conditions for veterans exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange in new locations, and other toxic substances. All of these presumptive service connections have had a major impact on veterans, making their claims easier to qualify for and expediting benefits to veterans. I mean, Zach, we've represented many veterans before these conditions became presumptive, and talk a little bit about how hard it was to get someone service connected prior to a presumption, for example. And I'm thinking of like a Thailand exposure case, for example.
Right. And if we use Thailand as an example, in order to achieve service connection and compensation, the presumptions make it so much easier because when that happens, there are fewer things that a veteran has to prove, both to the agency and if they have to the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims or to the federal courts in general, if they have to appeal their cases. The presumptions make that so much easier. And before the presumptions, you'd have to go through all of the steps to establish service connection and to achieve compensation, which means that you'd have to prove that you have a condition, that that condition is related to your time in service, and you'd have to do all of this oftentimes many years after a condition. For example, Agent Orange conditions can take years or decades to emerge. And without that presumption, it was really difficult to kind of go back 30, 40, 50, maybe 60 years and put a veteran in the right place at the right time with the right exposures, just because of the passage of time. And so the presumptions alleviate so much of that work and really help veterans get the benefits that they deserve, because the science has progressed so much that we now know so much more than we did. For example, during the Vietnam era, which is now 60 years ago, or going on 60 years ago, and even the Gulf War era, which is now going on 40 years. ago. So we're really talking about a lot of decades, and the presumptions have made it a lot easier for aging veterans in particular to understand what kind of conditions have emerged because of their exposures in service.
Another thing, Zach, that in the early days of the practice before the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, one of the biggest issues was the veteran's right to the duty to assist. And that was to get a medical examination to link their current disability to service. And they had to form what was called a well-grounded claim prior to 2000 in order to get the duty to assist. But things fundamentally changed in 2000 with the Veterans Claim Assistance Act, the VCAA. And what that law did was enable veterans to get medical examinations where the VA would schedule exams to automatically see whether a condition was related to service. But prior to 2000, it was much more difficult for veterans to get those examinations. So that was a big change as well. So another trend is sort of the increase in TDIU benefits. Can you discuss that a little bit, Zach?
Well, first let's define what TDIU is. When you say that, we're talking about total disability based upon individual unemployability. And it's essentially a way for a veteran to demonstrate to the Department of Veterans Affairs that they are unable to follow a substantially gainful occupation, or essentially unable to work because of a combination or because of the severity of one of their service-connected conditions. It started as a regulatory benefit that the Department of Veterans Affairs established, and what it does is it makes it more straightforward, frankly, to demonstrate a veteran's disability or disability picture, combination of disabilities, on their ability to be employed. And it makes it much easier than, let's call it, stacking all of their disabilities together to try to reach a 100% rating. Instead of doing that, if by evidence we're able to demonstrate that that combination or the severity of one of their conditions renders them unable to work or causes them unable to be in a gainful occupation, they then get a 100% disability rating, which can make a huge difference in veterans' lives.
And another change that happened in 2006 that became effective in June of 2007 was the ability for veterans to hire legal counsel at the notice of disagreement stage. And what impact did that have?
It's a huge impact. Before 2007, veterans were able to obtain legal counsel, either an accredited agent or attorney, and be able to pay them for their services only after a case went all the way to the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. After 2007, it was much earlier in the process that an attorney or accredited agent could be paid for their work. And the way that attorneys and accredited agents are paid is the subject of another talk. It is quite complicated. It is quite heavily regulated. And it is quite, the VA takes an enormous interest in it to protect veterans. And it is a complicated area in and of itself. But the punchline is that once that changed in 2007, there was much more widespread attorney involvement and accredited agent involvement, and people going out and getting certification and accreditation from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And it's led to a gigantic, I would say, increase in trained professionals helping veterans through the VA system.
Another thing that has been part of sort of our experience collectively over the last 30 plus years has been delays inherent in the system. Whether it was the filing of an initial claim, waiting for the initial decision, or the appeal to the board. And frankly, in the early years, the appeal from the board to the court.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the stakeholders, and by stakeholders, I mean all the people who work in the VA arena, so to speak, got together and decided to try to change the system. And that resulted in something called the Appeals Modernization Act. And could you talk a little bit about that?
The Appeals Modernization Act is I've been doing this now for 20 years, and it was the biggest change that I saw probably in veterans law, just because it was an entire overhaul of the VA system. And It happened in 2017. It is now 2015, and we're 2000. I'm sorry. Wow, I went back in time. It passed in 2017. It was implemented in 2019. We are now living in 2025, and we are really just now wrestling with the effects of the Appeals Modernization Act, just to give you an idea of the timeline and how long it takes to change a huge system like VA. I'll own up to something. I didn't really understand, and I kind of feared the Appeals Modernization Act when it passed. But as it has worked and as we're seeing it develop, I do think it is a very good thing for veterans and their families. And so I was a skeptic, and I am now something of a convert to the AMA. It hasn't fixed everything, but it has fixed a lot. And you talk about the delays in the system. What the Appeals Modernization Act does is it throws a little bit of complexity into the system. Because veterans have so much now more choice and control. Those were the buzzwords that VA kept using, choice and control. And you can see that whenever VA talks about it. And that choice has, as the court has said, has some consequences. Veterans really have to pay a little bit more attention to their claims. In my opinion, veterans should avail themselves of accredited agents and attorneys or our very fine VSO partners and colleagues in order to navigate the system. But it has really led to much quicker decisions. It has led to, over the course of time, it has really shown that there is more choice. It has really helped veterans to have a longer time frame in which to prove their cases in a lot of ways, because once they get an answer from one part of the Department of Veterans Affairs, they're able to quickly move to another part of the Department of Veterans Affairs or onto court more quickly so that they can get an answer to whether or not they're entitled to compensation and service-connected benefits.
So another thing that's changed over the last 30 plus years has been the focus on mental health conditions and really post-traumatic stress disorder. In the early days of my representing veterans prior to 2000, it was very hard to prove a claim for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the most difficult part in many cases was where a veteran who was not in combat but experienced a stressful event had to have an independent thing to verify that that stressful event occurred. Now you're talking about events in service that might have happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, where the veteran didn't have a witness at the time they filed their claim about what happened all those years ago. And so Congress and the VA finally started relaxing those standards to make it easier to prove those claims.
Well,
Go ahead.
this is another situation. Sorry to jump in, but this is another situation like the presumptions where we're seeing the science really catch up
Yes.
with people's lived experience, science as well as some of the destigmatization of mental health conditions, destigmatization of and understanding of some of the military sexual trauma that unfortunately veterans might experience during their time in service. And it's really where both society and science start catching up with human beings' lived experiences. And VA and Congress have it's taken a while, but they've been relatively responsive to our veterans and our service members' experience and actual effects of combat and other situations that they experienced during their time in service.
And really, this has opened up benefits to thousands of veterans who had previously been denied with these relaxed standards.
And speaking of science catching up, the shift towards digital claims and modernization.
Yeah, so this has been a fundamental change. When the VA finally decided to digitize all its files, that was a huge change. And it was the launch of the e-benefits program, VA.gov revamp in 2019. There are now automated tools for evidence gathering, compensation and pension exams, scheduling. All of this has led to a faster system. Things can always improve, but what I'm talking about is the difference from 25, 30 years ago to today. The claims are moving much more quickly because of all the technology that VA is implementing. And we're now able, when we represent a veteran and we send in our power of attorney, we're allowed to see it through the VBMS program, see their claim online, and it's very easy to essentially press a button and download their file now. Whereas in the early days, you would have to write for the file, and sometimes you're waiting 6 months, a year, just to get the veteran's file. And now it's really a push of a button. And that has been a dramatic change for the better for veterans.
It makes a huge difference in veterans' lives because time is money. And the quicker we can get resolution, the quicker we can get benefits delivered to our veterans, the better off they are and the better off our country is. So this was a bit of a walk down veterans benefits memory lane. And what we see as some of the biggest changes, some of the biggest advances, and some of the news that veterans need to know that happened in the VA world in the past 30 plus years.
And so the question inevitably comes up, what's next? Can we see down the road what future changes we're going to have?
I think the only certainty that we have is that it's going to keep changing. To be cliche, the only certainty is change, which is an old cliche, but always true. And it's hard for me to see 2 years in the future, let alone 5, 10, or the next 30. We have huge advances coming in the AI space. We have more and more people getting involved in VA benefits. We have major changes with this administration coming to VA personnel and the way that VA is going to administer its benefits, both health and compensation. And we will be here every step of the way at CCK to help veterans and their families navigate what is certain to be much more change for the next many decades.
Well, thank you, Zach, for this. This has been really great. And please follow us on our YouTube channel. And we look forward to updating you in the future.